Hello and welcome to Reducing Cloud Storage Costs. Today's webinar is sponsored by Quest and produced by ActualTech Media. My name is Scott Bekker. I'm from ActualTech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we will work with you to get it fixed. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you're going to find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to PDFs from Quest on slashing cloud backup costs with CoreStor and a data sheet on CoreStor. You'll also find in there a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to ActualTech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming webinars. So I encourage you to access all those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found also in your handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So I'm excited to introduce you to my fellow speaker today, Adrian Moir, who's technology strategist in the office of the CTO at Quest. So Adrian, great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be, and welcome to the workshop. As you can probably see
Excellent.
behind me.
As I said, I am really looking forward to our conversation today. Let me just quickly go through the agenda before we get started. So, some of the most popular use cases for the cloud are backup, disaster recovery, and long-term retention. And as more and more cloud is, or as more and more data is stored and copied in the cloud, what was once a small and almost negligible cost for cloud storage has started to significantly eat into technology budgets. And as those cost pressures increase, there are better ways to approach cloud storage than to simply push data up into the cloud. So Adrian and I are going to talk about how sort of no strategy for cloud cost or cloud storage cost reduction can begin with costs alone. And we'll look at many of the factors that must be taken into account. And as you can see from the agenda here, the flow will be, we'll talk about some major storage trends and issues. Then we'll get into general strategies for reducing costs. Then we'll get into some of the things that Quest CoreStor does to help with those cost reductions. And finally, we'll have time for your questions. So put those in the console as you have them, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Adrian, the first thing that I wanted to ask you about was, what are the things, at a high level, sort of that we're going to go through over the course of the day, but what do you need to think about before you think about reducing cloud costs?
Well, there's a few things I'd say that you kind of really want to get your arms around. One of which is obviously knowing what you want to put into cloud in terms of data. Knowing what you've got there already is just as important. And prioritizing as well. There's a couple of things around prioritizing. Obviously, the one at the top of everybody's mind these days is security, right? So that's something that's always a priority, and it's never a one and done, right? It's you got to keep on top of this. You can almost make it like a personal mission to make sure security is always there, but also prioritizing the data. I mean, what I often see is people sending everything because that's easy, right? They know they've got something, but it's also quite expensive as well. So think about the kind of data that you have, the different kind of data sets you want to push out into cloud. What are their uses? What would you need them for? And then be a little bit more intelligent about which kind of cloud tiering mechanism you might want to put them in, instead of just sticking them all in the first one that comes to mind, the hot blob storage or whatever object storage that's potentially the most expensive. Do you really need to have all of those data types in that kind of storage? So there's a couple of things to think about there. So just kind of get your arms around it, know what you're pushing up there, know what you've got there, and make sure you start prioritizing security and data type.
Okay, yeah, that's a great framing, and we'll get into a lot of those things through the course of the day, or the hour, I should say. And I do just want to jump in with just a chart here. This is a chart showing North America cloud storage market size, and this is from Fortune Business Insights, and they released it earlier this year. But if you think of your current storage cost management issues, and how challenging they are now, this chart kind of points to the idea that maybe you haven't seen anything yet. There's been this explosion of cloud storage in North America, but on the scale of this chart, you can see it's been relatively linear for the last 5 years or so, and the expectation is it's going to kind of go off the charts over the next 6 years. And so they're looking at a CAGR of 24% during this forecast period, with ending up in like the $376 billion range in spending by 2029. One of the biggest drivers here is an increasing volume of unstructured data. So as important as controlling cloud costs has been up until now, it's probably going to get even more important over the next few years. And so, Adrian, I wanted to ask you, in your experience, talking with customers and, and other industry experts, what have you seen? How out of control can cloud costs get?
Well, I think it's very interesting. The previous slide you had as well, showing the growth of things. And I think it's kind of pertinent to also think about what that's doing to a business. We are generating more and more data in our business. Our businesses have become data centric. We can't do without it anymore. And one of the things that we do is that, we have to protect that amount of data, and obviously want to use cloud because it's a great model. It's, fairly static data in, when you're talking kind of backup and recovery, it doesn't or shouldn't change. And of course, the more that we have coming in, the more we'll end up protecting, the more we'll end up kind of using. But getting out of control, there's a few ideas and thoughts around this, because what we tend to find is people think, I'm just going to stick it out in cloud. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind mentality, and I'm just going to put it up there. And you soon find out when it's out of control, when your head of finance comes to you and say, hey, what's this bill for? Why is this so big all of a sudden, right? And this is the interesting thing. It's no longer like we used to have in a traditional data center, where you'd have CapEx budget and you go and spend it on some disks or a tape library and tapes or whatever you were using, and you were kind of done for like 3 years, and that was that. Now you're going to get a bill every single month, and you have to pay that every single month, right? It's no longer, I can sweat the hardware another 2 years, instead of 3 years, I'll run it 5. That doesn't happen anymore. You're going to get a bill. And when it gets out of control, you're going to have the finance guy all over your back saying, hey, we've got to do something about this. And you go, well, I have to keep everything up there. And that's when you come into the point of, do I have to keep everything up there? Can I make this cheaper? And, how do I get the finance guy, the CFO, off my back and say, we'll get this under control. So it's not always about the data itself, but it's more about that costs and getting the costs under control. You might need the data, and you might turn around to your CFO and say, I'm sorry, this is what it costs to do this. And he's going to come back and probably tell you, find something cheaper. Now that's going to be headache straight away, because you think, oh, do I have to move it all to another cloud provider that's cheaper? Or, so there's lots of things that can hurt you before you kind of take the big step and start throwing data out there. So I've seen it a few times. I've seen it, people going, oh, I've got this huge bill. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to start deleting things, or I'm going to start reducing my retention. So the outcome of it getting out of control, you actually start to, put your business at risk now. You're reducing the required retention for your business. You're putting some risk in there as averse to kind of figuring out why it's out of control. So people tend to try and take the quicker routes, but it's not always the right way.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, great point. And we'll get back to some more horror stories actually later as well.
Yes, indeed.
But when you were talking about, sort of the big picture of things that you had to think about, obviously a big one was security. So,
yeah,
you know, um, what should people be thinking about from a storage perspective when it comes to security?
well, there's again, it's kind of multifaceted, and it's quite an interesting one recently. I mean, everybody's been obviously talking about immutability, and we're all don't want the whole ransomware thing, and prevention is better than cure, right? But at the end of the day, if we're looking at recovering data from anywhere, that is the cure. So hopefully, your prevention stuff should actually stop you from ever wanting to use the cure, but we still have to have one. And security is really important in this piece. And I'm gonna hop on the ransomware bandwagon just a little bit to describe why this is a little bit of a different thought here. A lot of people say, yeah, we've got our backup data into cloud, and we've made it immutable. We've turned on object locking. Done. We're quite happy with that. And yeah, sure, that's
Right.
great. The data can't be changed. Fantastic. I'd say that's step one. That's the basic thing that you should be doing. The next step should be thinking about the data itself that is sat in that cloud account. Now, if we go back a few years, I've been around in IT an awful long time. It's horrible. It's I count it in decades now. When we used to have tapes in a data center, right? So what did we used to do before we took the data out? We used to make it immutable. We click on the side of the tape so it couldn't be overwritten. And before it went out of sight, off site, we made sure the data we'd written to that tape was encrypted. All data going off site was always encrypted. You always had to do that. That was one of the business mandates. And a lot of people have forgotten this with cloud storage. They think it's in the cloud, I've put object locking on it. That's the same as clicking that little tab down on the tape library. I can't write to it anymore. That's all that's doing. The data is sat there in a readable format. If it's in a readable format that somebody else that is not part of your organization can understand, they're going to gain from that. So back to the ransomware point here, is that ransomware does two things normally. One is they want to stop your business so that you want to pay them money to get them back up and running again. The other one is they are going to think about what else they can get out of it, and it's the ransom part. Right? It's not about the encryption of all your data. It's about what can I sell to somebody else? What can I make you be embarrassed about? If I can have your data out and I can understand it, I can actually then ransom you against that or release it to whoever, to the highest bidder. So there's the other piece. If the data is readable in cloud, if your cloud account gets compromised, then it doesn't matter whether you've got object locking on it at all or not. They can still read it. They'll take it out, and then they're going to ransom you on it. And that's, you're kind of dead. So there's two things now we've got to think about. Is one is the immutability aspect, but also encrypting it and obfuscating data that you put up into cloud such that it can't just be openly read by somebody outside your organization. And that again comes down to security of who's allowed access to the the configuration of the cloud accounts and the buckets and all the rest of it. And you have to think about that kind of model too, that you should push up, same as you would internally for a kind of administrators. You're going to have to make sure that's done as well. So there's a few extra steps than just turning on the object locking. Unfortunately, these are the times we live in, and we have to deal with all of these things now.
Yeah. Yeah. The encryption is, I mean, it's always been a good idea. I mean, you're talking back in the tape days, that was, I mean, tapes are still available, but I mean, that was generally before ransomware, when you're talking about, and certainly before ransomware exploded the degree it was. So there was value in it, for security and other reasons. But then with ransomware, and what you're saying, especially about the last few years of ransomware, where they're, reselling your data, or not reselling it, using that as an additional reason to force you to pay, that they're going to release it. That's really valuable. So we hit on two of the things that I think we were going to talk about with security, the encryption and the immutability, but there was one other consideration that I know you have in mind, which is human error. It's been on your mind. So
yes, to err is human, right? So
yeah,
and it happens to all of us, right? We all do things. I've done things in the past that I'm not proud about, and
in the past, for
deleting
me, it's
things.
today.
I'm not going to go that far, thanks, Scott. But yeah, I mean, we all make mistakes, right? I mean, we are human, and we delete things by mistake. We misconfigure things by mistake, and the level of complexity of some systems and solutions that we use now have got to a point where a simple mistake can lead to wider consequences. It's dropping the instead of a small pebble into the lake now, it's like I'm going to throw in half a ton of bricks into the lake, and that ripple is going to get even bigger and even further. And specifically, when we get into solutions that are kind of all interwoven, a really good example of that is Microsoft 365. The way that all the services have a level of dependency on each other. And when you're looking at things like profiles, I think there's a really good example that we've seen out there in the past. Yeah, there we go. That's the one. So here's a really interesting one. KPMG. Somebody was just trying to change something on a different profile on a single user. Instead, they applied it to all of them, all 145,000 users. They all lost all of their personal chats in Teams. Gone. So if you've ever been in a scenario where you might have relied on a chat or something, or I mean, chat's maybe not the primary aspect here. It's the fact that there was an ability for somebody to do something this big and this simply, and it was all gone. And that data is not there. That Microsoft is not going to recover that for them. It's not going to come back. It's gone. And this is some of the things that people don't often realize, again, about a cloud-based solution, that simple things like this can actually be quite destructive. I hate to think if it was done on things like documents and all sorts, and things were purged out of recycle bins and lots of horrible things.
Right.
So, it happens, right? It's human error. And it's one of the highest reasons for data loss in our business. It's that we get in the way of ourselves and we make the problems ourselves. So, when you come into this kind of thing, when you're thinking about moving data and storing it out in cloud, automation is the key. That's the key thing here. It's to be hands off. Once it's set up, once you're happy with it, it needs to do this itself. It doesn't need constant, adjustment or change all the time.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that's been a good discussion of sort of security aspects and considerations. I know that going forward from here in the conversation, cloud object storage is important. I wonder if you can just sort of level set for us. Just give us a quick explanation of how cloud object storage, differs from other types of storage, and why it's become so important in cloud environments.
I think it's become, I guess, a little bit ubiquitous in terms of where it's delivered from. If we go back and think about, originally the plan for this kind of technology was for a SaaS-based application to store things in. If we go back a little bit further than that, we look at object storage was around not so much the actual blocks of data, but the metadata that surrounds it. And the idea was that this was, the forward piece of archiving, where you could store data, and instead of searching through the data, you would search through the metadata associated with the objects, hence the object storage piece. So it became a different way of looking at the data sets, and a simpler way that you can actually access information based on the data you have stored, instead of actually trawling through the data all the time, which then lends itself really well to when you want to scale and get really very, very big. You're then at this point of, instead of having to trawl through stuff, you can look at lightweight metadata. So the cloud storage thing has become kind of a secondary thought, as it were, as we've gone forward, people have thought, well, hang on a minute, what about if I can just push this up there? Do I need to understand the metadata so much, or do I control that with my application? Does my application even have to be in the cloud anymore? And that's where the change has happened now. We've seen this, oh, hang on a minute, this is huge bucket storage that's almost, dare I say, infinite. I mean, it obviously has boundaries and costs and limits and all that kind of stuff, but it's very easy to access. It's like when virtualization kind of kicked off in a big way. We could spin up virtual machines really easy, simple, straightforward, away we go. And we ended up with VM sprawl as the outcome of that one. And cloud storage is kind of similar in as much as it's easy, it's simple, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, it's somewhere else, it's off site. So we're ticking that box. And, if we do the immutability, the encryption, we're ticking those boxes. And it just gets bigger and bigger, and I don't have to worry about it. And it's the don't have to worry about it becomes the interesting thing. But there you go. That's the challenge, right? When you get into that piece of, I don't have to worry about this, that's when you're going to have problems. That's when the costs are going to start mounting up. It's just like any other storage system that you should look after. You need to understand it and put your boundaries around it and say, that's what I need to do. That's how much I can afford to use. That's another interesting one. Think about budgeting what you can use and set a limit on yourself. Say, that's it. If I go beyond this, I've got to tell my CFO we're going to go beyond it, and why. So all these kind of challenges are kind of popping up, whereas potentially the traditional use for what we would class as being object storage, I think, is probably being superseded a little bit by people just spotting that this is a great opportunity just to throw the data somewhere else. I don't have to buy the hardware. I don't have to do it, rack it. I don't have to call it. I don't have to do all these other things in a traditional data center. Somebody else does that for me. I don't have to worry about it. And to a certain extent, that's true. But at the end of the day, it's still your data. You're still the owner of the data. Whoever is running that object storage, wherever it happens to be, they really don't care about your data. They're there for the service. They'll keep the service up and running. But if your data gets destroyed, moved, deleted, they're not going to help you unless you've bought another service that enables you to get a copy of that data back. So again, it's another cost. So all these challenges we're kind of putting in place, we're kind of offsetting what we used to do in a data center, and they're just kind of forgetting about it. And that's one of the challenges with object storage. It's almost too easy. And that gives us the growth problems, the cost problems. It's almost too easy. And that can be a challenge at times.
Gotcha. And, you've been talking about various costs, related to these challenges, but there's one that, is also a huge issue that, it's been apparent from the beginning of the major cloud days, but people are still struggling with it. And that's the egress cost issue. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the egress cost issue, again, it's one of those things that people don't think about. I often, now that we're kind of back talking to audiences live as well, which is kind of nice, I often ask a question of, what's your budget for recovery? And there's this silence across an audience. Has anybody put any budget aside for recovering data? And people kind of look at each other and think, what? No? Where's your data? It's in cloud. It's going to cost you money to get that data out, certainly from the big providers. And this is the piece that another one of those challenges that people miss is that the whole point that we back up our data and we keep it somewhere is that we are going to want to recover it at some point, to reuse that data for whatever reason. And that's going to cost us money. Now, traditionally, we'll go back to that data center model again. That was already wrapped into all the costs that you paid for your extra disks and your tape library and the tapes you buy. You've paid for that recovery cost. You're done. You might have to, bring it back on site. It's a little extra time maybe, but you've paid for that. With cloud, you haven't paid for that yet. And you're going to get that bill at the end of the month. And, if you want to start pulling terabytes of data back out because you need to rebuild something, it's going to cost you money. And again, this is the budget issue. This is the bit that people miss. And, we've seen some examples of this as well. And there's been a really big example. This is a favorite one of mine. Now, I'm a great fan of NASA. I think they do lots of great stuff, and this was particularly around their Earth observation data sets that they had collected. I think it was terabytes per day they were pulling off across multiple missions, and they stored it all in AWS. They did a great deal with AWS to store it, but they forgot about the egress costs. So, of the 247 petabytes of data, they couldn't afford to egress chunks of it out to actually go and work on the data that they've collected. So if I thought this from a business perspective, I'd be really, really annoyed if I was a C-level saying, I've paid all this money to put it somewhere, and now you're telling me I can't afford to get it back to actually do the work on it. That's not a good place to. I wouldn't want to be that IT guy, right? I mean, that would be not a place to be. So again, this comes down to that egress cost, right? It's that budget. Are you going to budget for recovery? It's very important that you think about that too.
Yeah. So, in addition to budgeting for recovery, what are some of the things that you can do, to either minimize your egress costs or to solve those issues?
Well, minimizing egress cost. Shop around. Don't be put off by saying I have to go with AWS or I have to go with Azure or I have to go with Google. Sure, all good, all fine, all solid, all stable, but there are other suppliers out there that can offer you better egress costs. There's one that springs to mind that's very, very popular, and that's Wasabi. They have a reduced cost model. So if this is a concern, then shop around. If you don't want to get hit with egress costs when you least want it because you're having to recover some data, the last thing you want is to have another big bill land on your doorstep as well. So shop around, go and have a look, go and find out, go and work out as well, and find those that are simple in their model. I don't know if anybody here, they might want to put a comment up, say, has anybody tried to work out what their costs are really going to be with AWS? When you've done all the transactional information and the ups and the downs and the reading, and it's almost impossible. And I've tried it several times, and I can't get to the end of it because the model is so complex. They put everything in there for you to do. It's not simple. So it's kind of hard to work out precisely until you've done it. And then you go, oh, that's how much it costs. Maybe a little too late by then. But yeah, shop around. You just maybe pay more for convenience. You and those big guys as well. I mean, if you've got a lot of data, they'll do a deal, and try and get the egress costs as part of that deal. Get it baked in so that you know what the likelihood is of the costs that you're gonna get when you do egress that one.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, a little bit more broadly, so we just talked about this in the sense of egress costs, but just, overall with, selecting the right cloud storage, what are some best practices there?
Well, I guess, a part of the shopping around piece, service level agreements, everybody assumes everything's up all the time now. I mean, that's just human nature, right? We want it all to be working all the time. It's not reality, unfortunately. I think we saw a Teams outage just last week. So service level agreements, what do they do in terms of allowing access to the data? How quickly can you get it back? And what kind of cost structure if you want another copy of it in a different redundant location, for example? And do they have intelligent recovery plans? Again, that costing piece. Is it a flat cost model? Does it ramp up the more you pull out? Understand exactly what the proposition is when you're talking to the provider, and it's almost like buying a car. Don't be afraid to play one off against the other. You didn't hear this from me, right? So if you've got costing from one which you think the one that you really want to go to could be better, then hey, dangle it in front of them and say, I'm getting a better deal from your competitors. How important is my business? And you'll soon find out which is the right one to go with. So I would think, all the usual things you would do when you're having any other kind of conversation with any other vendor, have the same conversation with them. Ask them the hard questions, and if they can provide you the right answers, then you're getting good to selecting that kind of storage. And there are other things you can do beyond that too. So let me get into that, I guess, the next bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so that's about, sort of comparing, vendors and making sure that you're comparing apples and oranges and dangling one deal in front of another vendor. Always a best practice. But what can people do, internally in terms of their own data or the way they approach their data? What do you recommend?
Well, so there's a few things here. There's the ability to, as you said, kind of at the beginning, is to understanding your data. But there are a few simple things that you can think about before you get to push the data up. And we get into the kind of piece around optimizing the data. Now, there's two things that you've got here on the slide. There's two distinct differences here between replication and tiering. And they're quite often mixed together. They quite often get misunderstood. People think, oh, I've just moved my data to cloud. I've got a replica up there. And it's not, it's a move. If you think about that for a moment, when we move something, even on my laptop, it goes from one place to another. It doesn't leave anything behind. It's not a copy. And this is where we have to be careful. Replication is a pure copy. It's a second set of data that gets copied and stored somewhere. Tiering is an extension primarily of the storage that you have, and you're going to move it based on some sort of policy, and it's going to move up there, and hopefully it would leave some information behind so you can access it, and it would carry some information forward with it so you can access it if things go horribly wrong. So two things about this is that before you start doing replication and tiering, you want to optimize the data set. You've got to get it to a point where it is as lean as possible. We've spoken about this already. It's got to be encrypted. It's going off-site, so therefore you want to protect your intellectual property. You've got to encrypt it as well. So you've got to get this really refined data set based on just the data you think you're going to need for a certain amount of time that's applicable to the business, and then you start really reducing the data set down. And once you've got it there, then encrypt it, then send it. And once you get into those pieces, you can either choose whether you want to have an extension with tiering or whether you need to have a secondary copy, which is a best practice if we all go to the 3-2-1 rule. Then having a second copy of it fully is likely to mean that you're going to have to run things slightly differently. You're probably going to have some compute up there in the cloud alongside the storage. You're going to have some intelligence next to it, as it's the intelligence that allows you access to that data in terms of recovery.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot. So, before we get into CoreStor, I wonder if you can just maybe summarize a little bit about some of the things that we've talked about here is just sort of general best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Clean and mean. That's the way I like to position this. Is really understand the model that you're going to get into, the cloud consumption model. You're gonna have to pay the bills. Understand what that consumption is likely to look like. Must take security into account. You're going to have to make sure that things are encrypted before it leaves. It's one of the most important things that you could do. Optimize your cloud object storage. So optimize that data before it gets to the object storage. Make it as lean as possible. It's going to help with your costs. And then we have that piece at the bottom. When I was talking about the human error piece, the last thing you'd want to do is to say, I have to manually manage this every other day and keep moving and changing and updating. That needs to be automatic. That needs to be out of the hands of a human that can go and do more damage than good. So, by the time you've kind of gone through all of this, you should have a secure, optimized, well-costed, automated storage system that you can then sit back and think, okay, I'm good with this now. Once you've got to that point, don't forget to assess it on a regular basis. You're going to get a bill on a regular basis. You need to keep your eyes on it on a regular basis. If you can set some alarms at certain sizes, do so. Have a regular cadence with the rest of the team to understand any kind of growth. Use some of the cloud vendors' tools if they have them to monitor the growth rate. So you can start thinking about, when do I flag this to the CFO, just to make sure he's aware that we're growing and we're growing for the right reasons. So there's a few things there to think about. And, make sure you're not, this is an interesting one, don't put redundant data up there. Don't put the same stuff up there. So many people do that, and they think, well, I've got a copy of this and a copy of this and a copy of this, thinking it's all different. There's a ton of data up there that's redundant that you don't really need to put up there. I think you probably can understand where that one's heading. But yes, essentially, you've got to own it. It's not one of these things you can just throw it out up there and forget about it. You really have to own it. If you want to be successful with this, it's got to be something that you have to own and do and get on with.
Okay. Well, I wonder if, over the next portion here, if you can walk us through how CoreStor helps with some of this stuff.
All right, I certainly can. So let's introduce you to a little bit of technology that we have at Quest that will help you with this journey. And I always kind of take this as the point of view as this particular conversation we're having is actually a subset of the technology that we can deliver. The technology is called CallStore. It's a fully software-defined storage solution, which means you can run it on any hardware, given the right resources. You can run it in a virtual machine. You can run it in cloud. It's very, very agile. It's kind of very, very good in that aspect. Now, CoreStor does a lot of things. It gives us a lot of ability in terms of data deduplication, compression, encryption, all those things we kind of been touching on today as well. We can accelerate data, we can push things out to cloud, and we can replicate as well. But again, around the cost piece, this is the bit I kind of really want to focus on here, is the cost piece on this, is that I'm going to focus on a certain set of areas inside CoreStor around reducing storage costs. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about. So that's where I'm going to focus on this with this technology. And I'm going to give you a kind of a way of looking at this in like I guess in terms of an expression. Now, I like to do the maths on this kind of stuff because I'm a maths geek, and I'll give you an equation on how to work this out. It's a bit like the AWS kind of, how do I work out cloud, right? I mean, this kind of stuff is not going to work. That's actually a Hawking radiation equation. So I told you I was a bit of a geek. So that's not the equation you want to use to work on this. What you want to think about is really, really simple. There's a message here. Sometimes you have to spend money to save money. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but it does bear thinking about. If I can be light on my costs, but really heavy on the savings that I will get out the back end, I can actually then implement technologies that will actually enable me to actually meet the requirements I have for my cloud storage and my costs. And this is one of the things that CoreStor is really very good at. So I'm going to give you a little run through, and I'm going to take you through the savings part of this. I'm going to actually put some figures up on the screen here, some real kind of numbers. So this is a snapshot of the user interface of CoreStor. This is one that we have running all the time. It sits there. We ingest data into it on a regular basis. Now I'm gonna zoom in on this piece here, and this will show you that we've ingested into CoreStor. It's 318 terabytes, just over. And that's the little bit just there. We've ingested that amount of data into CoreStor. It has deduplicated that down to 7.7 terabytes. Primary role of CoreStor, deduplication, storage target for backup. We do it for 13 different backup applications we support. We're then going to compress that even further after we've deduplicated it down to 4.3 terabytes. So I've ingested 318 terabytes, and I've got this down to 4.3 terabytes. And that gives me a 98.7% storage saving, which is extremely good. Now, I will say your mileage will vary, but we see figures like this on a regular basis out there. So if I now think about that piece, right, there's my used capacity, 4.28 terabytes that I've actually consumed there from 318. That's pretty good. So now thinking about the cloud piece, of that 318 218 terabytes we put in, our automated policy, there's the little automation piece there, has, from the policy settings we put in, has identified 296 terabytes of that 318 that's going to send it out to cloud. And of that 296 terabytes, that is already deduplicated down to 4.8 and then further compressed down to 2.4. And that actually gives us a cloud storage saving of around about 99.2%. So instead of sending 296 terabytes of data to cloud, I'm only going to send 2.4. In fact, it's a bit more than that. If you look down at the bottom here, you'll see it says it's just over 3 terabytes. And that's because we put metadata alongside that in object storage, so that if CoreStor, for whatever reason, decides to fall over, we can actually still recover all the data back out of that cloud storage, even though it's just sat in native object storage. So having the metadata in there is quite important. Now, on top of all of this, your data is sent there now, it's deduplicated, it's optimized, it's compressed. We'll also encrypt it for you before it leaves CoreStor. And then it will get into cloud, and there you have your lean, mean, encrypted data set sat there. The metadata is also obfuscated. The content we store, it's chopped up and put into a file structure that is not the same as the original, so it can't be understood. The encryption we have two pieces. We have a normal AES 256-bit encryption piece, and then we have a no-knowledge super encipherment technology that's patented that goes on top of that if you so wish, and we can actually change the encryption automatically by pulling out a unique block of data and using that as part of the cipher. Nobody knows what that is. Even I can't track that. And that gets put on top. And then you can change that block every so many days. So your data sets get re-encrypted as you go forward. Super hard for people to break apart. So we have the security side piece covered. We have that piece covered too. We've got the data is now lean and mean. We're storing way less now. So what does it look like in terms of cost? So let's take this particular model and work out what it would cost to do this. So if I'm going to take the standard AWS S3 standard pricing is my model. It's tiered. It's cents per gigabyte per month, and it's based on the amount of terabytes you put in. So now if I take my 296 terabytes of data that I was about to send up there, and if I apply that into their model, and I'm being really simple with this model, I've got none of the other bits and pieces that are hard to work out. I'm just going to make this super simple. So the first 50 terabytes goes up. Every month for the first 50 terabytes, I'm going to be looking at $1,770. And then the following amount of data going up, the next 246 out of our total, it's going to cost me another $6,600 a month, just over. So per month, if I just put 296 terabytes of data up there per month, every month I'm going to get a bill that's $7,852.22 every single month. Now, if I do that over a year, that works out at just over $94,000. So you think, okay, that's not overly cheap. So now if I think about taking that data that we reduced with CoreStor all the way down from 296 all the way down to 3 terabytes, and I'm going to put that in there, it's just going to be the first tier, and it's going to be $71 a month. And then for a year, you're looking at less than $1,000. So you could probably spot the bad and the good from this fairly easily. Now, this is a very simple point of view. We say, okay, well, that's the savings part. It's very heavy on that. Or what about the cost? What's it going to cost me to get to this point? What does the CoreStor technology utilize that it's going to cost? So right now I'm seeing a 99% cloud storage cost reduction. That's fantastic. But wrapped into that is the cost of actually getting there along that journey. So let's do that. I'm going to take quite a large example here because I've been working with smaller amounts of data, but if you've got bigger, you can. So I'm going to put in the cost, an approximately indicative cost of a 20 terabyte server, single 2U box, a dozen disks across the front. Most of those suppliers out there can produce that for you. Then we look at, let's do this over 3 years. That's very popular right now. So we can do a 3-year term cost for CoreStor, $420 $1.49 per terabyte per year. So for 3 years, that looks like a scary number, $151,376. Okay, so add that with the server cost, and then we kind of get up to the 3-year solution price of nearly $169,000. Here's where it gets interesting. I'm going to add in my 3-year cloud costs associated with our reduced data set. So that's just over $2,500. So my overall solution for 3 years of moving that amount of data that would have been 296 comes to $171,534. Cost of doing nothing for 3 years. In other words, just throwing up there your $296. Sorry, 296 terabytes. I've got dollars on the brain today. Cost of doing nothing at all. Well, you're looking at $282,679. You can read that number on there. It's a lot of money. Savings with that CoreStor solution over 3 years is going to get you $111,145 back. That is a cost reduction overall of 61%. So here I spent some money, but I saved even more. I'm actually going to save the business $111,145 over a period of 3 years. Now you can chop that into 3. You could turn around and say, hey, this is my budget I've got for my egress costs. If you want to flatten it out completely, you could put that aside. However you want to do with that saving, it's a real saving. So we spent some money, we've got some technology, but my overall outcome now is a lean, well-costed, automated, encrypted solution that manages my data and moves it out to cloud in more intelligent ways. Now, the real interesting thing is when we get to the kind of egress conversation too, right? So people say, well, what happens if I have to pull that data back? What happens? Well, CoreStor's intelligent. What it will actually do, it will actually look at the blocks it has in its deduplication map first, find the blocks that match the request you're making, and any gaps it will fill in from cloud. So you're not actually putting all of the data back before you start restoring. It starts restoring straight away, and then it will fill in the gaps for you, and it will do that completely seamless. Regardless of whatever backup application you're using, it will do that itself. It's completely automated. It knows where everything is. So now instead of pulling my whole backup out of cloud, I'm only going to pull parts of it. So my egress costs are also going to be reduced too. So now I've got actually a more cost-effective solution for not only backup, but also recovery at the same time. So that brings me to the end of the numbers piece. Well, obviously now if you want to go out and learn a bit more about this, you can. I have a little QR code up there, or for the old school guys, you can, like me, you can type it in at the bottom as well. If you want to go and learn more about it, just hop over to quest.com, and there's a long link there as well as using that QR code. Right, I think we're at the end of things there, Scott.
Yeah. No, Adrian, thanks for that math. That was good. Appreciate it. It's always nice to see the work. It's like it's
something that I get quite excited when I can actually put dollars to something instead of some kind of nebulous message of, hey, it's great. These are the real numbers. So it's always good to do that.
Yeah. So are you ready for some audience questions?
Yeah, let's have some audience questions. Let's see if we can answer a few of these questions.
All right. Ned and some others had deployment questions. What if you could talk a little bit about the deployment options for CoreStor?
Well, deployment options are quite nice, actually. As I said, it's completely software, and it is literally a piece of software. It runs on Linux. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can build your own Linux hardware or a virtual machine and install CoreStor on there. We have a binary installer. Or you can have a virtual machine image. We do those too. So you can actually just pull down an OVA or an executable for Hyper-V 2. And now if you're in cloud, you will actually find CoreStor in both the Azure and AWS marketplaces. And so you can spin it up out there if you so wish. We give you examples of machines up there and images. So you have the AWS AMI image, plus also a server image in Azure as well. already done. You can pick the size you want. We do it in kind of several sizes. So depending on what size you want, you can do that. The nice thing about the cloud versions is that they don't use spinning disk or SSD inside the virtual machine for any of the main storage repositories. CoreStore is a bit smarter than that. We can actually use object storage for its main storage repository. So again, we've got the cheaper end of the storage being used for where all the data may be replicated up to. So deployment-wise, you could have one on-premise, you could have one running up in AWS, and you can replicate. You could have one running in AWS and replicate to one running in Azure. Or if you want to do the cloud tiering, either on-prem or from cloud for wherever you've got it set up, you can tier that out to AWS, Azure, Google, IBM Cloud, Wasabi, a generic S3 connector as well, if you've got something that's not on the list. And we're going to add one more soon as well. We're in conversations with another cloud storage provider, and I can't talk about that one yet, but there's another one coming along to that big long list as well. So hopefully, deployment, super simple.
Great. We had a couple of questions about third-party integrations here. You were just talking about the cloud integrations, but one of them is does CoreStore's recycle bin work with other backup solutions?
Yes, that's a very good question. It does. I'll take a popular one out there. Veeam, super popular. It's been around a while. Now, Veeam, uses CIFS or NFS to go and store its data sets, which you can do with CoreStore. CoreStore is actually a Veeam-ready repository as well, so we've gone through those hoops too. And there is a recycle bin technology inside CoreStore that, if anybody deletes something out of a container, that where the data is being held inside CoreStore and the recycle bin is turned on, it drops into that recycle bin. It is literally like a traditional recycle bin, except it's immutable. Once it's in the recycle bin, you can't delete it, you can't change it. It has a time span on it that works in days, from 7 to 30. You get to choose how long that recycle bin operates for. And lots of people say to me, "Oh, what happens if I just forward the clock on the machine?" No, we're smarter than the average bear. We count the ticks when the service is running, and we equate those ticks to the number of days. So you can turn the machine off for a week, you turn it back on, it's just going to start where it left off from. You can forward the date. That doesn't work either because we haven't counted enough ticks of the system running. So it's solid, it's in there, right? It's stuck. The only way you can get access to the data is to restore it back again. So that's done by a CoreStore admin. They log in. We also have multi-factor authentication capability too for that. So you can have that secure login experience, and they can then recover the data, and it goes back to where it was. So it's instant. Because we don't actually make a copy of the data, we don't move the data, we just flag it, make it immutable, and it sits there in its deduplicated format. As soon as you want it again, we unflag it, and it becomes available back into that share again, and away you go. So it's a really good technology, and yes, it works with other backup solutions.
Okay, and part of your answer on dedupe might have answered this one, but the question was, can you do source-side deduplication with other backup solutions?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. CoreStore is one of those products that I really like because you can just say yes to most questions. Yes, you can. We actually have some protocol accelerators. We have obviously our in-house one, which is called RDA, which works with our backup products, as well as one other out in the market called Bridgehead. We also have some protocol optimizers for NFS and for SMB-based connections. So it will work with things like Veeam, for example, and we actually do that on the fly. So we can have source-side deduplication coming out from a bunch of proxies in a virtual environment, sending data directly to CoreStore, and it only sends what we need to send. It reduces network traffic, which means the interfaces on CoreStore aren't flooded, which means you could run more backups in the same amount of time, greater throughput. So yes, we can do source-side dedupe with other applications. If you're a Veritas piece, we also support OST as well, so that's going to give you the same kind of outcome.
Okay, super. have a question here from Gary, who's wondering, what's the best way to verify the security of data in the cloud? And he's wondering about external penetration tests and things like that. But, any thoughts there?
That's an interesting one. Who do you trust to try and break into it? Now, obviously, you're probably not going to go to your next door neighbor and say, "Hey, see what you can do with this." One of the things, I guess, is to understand the mechanisms you've used to secure it. How secure are those mechanisms? Your users, your passwords. What kind of keys have you used? A good example of this kind of thing is when we back up Microsoft 365, for example. We used to use credentials, and now we're moving into certificates as well. So certificates don't change as often; they're less likely to be tampered with, etc. So again, it's looking at those mechanisms that you use to access. If you want to ensure that something can't get in, there is no better way than a pen test, or you get a very reputable company. I've even got Kevin Mitnick's business card here. If you ever wanted to get hold of those guys, his is a set of lockpicks. That's his business card.
I have one of those. Yeah,
you have one of those.
That's a cool card.
It's a cool card. So if you want to really, really be 100%, then you're going to have to be looking at somebody that's reputable, that will actually go and do those tests for you and find all the holes for you.
Yeah. Well, Adrian, this has been a fantastic discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I hope the audience has as well. Any sort of closing thoughts for us here as we wrap up?
Closing thoughts, I guess. Don't make cloud storage your enemy. Make it your friend. That's the key thing. It can easily become a monster out of control, but if you keep it under control and understand what you're doing and what you're doing it with and how you're doing it, you're going to give your business a whole better experience as well. And of course, I'd have to plug at the end. Of course, you can do all of that with CoreStor. I'm not going to pass that opportunity up. But yes, get on top of it. Put your arms around it. Start owning the data that you're putting up there.
Excellent. Well, Adrian, thanks so much for being here. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate your time and the update on Quest as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, and with that, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And our winner today is Jerry Gillespie from Virginia. So congratulations to Jerry. We will be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the ActualTech Media team, I want to thank Quest for making this event possible. Again, I want to thank Adrian for a great conversation, and thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. So have a great day.